I used to take the same train home every evening after work. It was part of my routine, something I never really thought twice about. The train wasn't usually too crowded at that hour, and I enjoyed having a bit of quiet time to read or listen to music. That day, though, I noticed something was different as soon as I stepped onto the platform. There was a man standing near the edge of the platform, pacing back and forth. He wasn't dressed like a typical commuter, no briefcase or work bag, just an old hoodie and jeans that looked like they'd seen better days. At first, I didn't pay much attention. People come and go on the train every day, and most of them aren't worth a second glance. But as I moved closer, I realized he was muttering to himself, and not in the way people do when they're on the phone. It was like he was having a full-blown argument with someone who wasn't there. I tried not to stare. You never know what someone's going through, and it felt wrong to judge him based on a first impression. I took my usual spot near the middle of the platform and pulled out my phone, hoping to look busy. The train arrived a few minutes later, and I got on, finding an empty seat near the door. A moment later, the man got on too. I could feel his presence before I even looked up. He sat across from me, not directly, but just enough that he was in my peripheral vision. He kept muttering under his breath, rocking slightly in his seat. I told myself to focus on my phone, to ignore him, and not make eye contact. The train was mostly empty, so I figured he'd probably get off at the next stop, and that would be the end of it. But he didn't. Stop after stop, he stayed there, his muttering growing louder and more frantic. I couldn't make out most of what he was saying, but every now and then I caught a word or two. Something about being followed. Something about someone watching him. The way he kept glancing around the train, his eyes darting from passenger to passenger to passenger, made me uneasy. It felt like he was searching for someone, and I prayed it wasn't me. The train started to empty out as we got closer to the suburbs. By the time we reached my stop, there were only a handful of people left. I got up quickly, trying not to draw attention to myself. As the doors opened, I stepped onto the platform and headed for the exit, walking as fast as I could without breaking into a run. I thought I was in the clear until I heard footsteps behind me. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Lots of people got off at this stop, and someone walking in the same direction didn't mean anything. But when I glanced over my shoulder, my heart sank. It was him. The man was a few steps behind me, his hood pulled up now. He wasn't muttering anymore, which somehow made it worse. The silence felt oppressive, like it was building up to something. I quickened my pace, clutching my bag tightly. The path from the train station to my apartment wasn't well lit, and I cursed myself for not taking an earlier train. I reached the main road and felt a brief surge of relief. There were a few cars passing by, and the presence of other people made me feel a little safer. I crossed the street and turned down the block toward my building, thinking I had finally lost him. But then I heard the footsteps again. I panicked. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios, and I realized I had no idea what I would do if he caught up to me. I decided to take a detour, walking past my building and heading toward a nearby convenience store. If he was still following me, at least there would be people around who could help. When I reached the store, I hesitated at the entrance, glancing back to see if he was still there. He was. He had stopped a few feet away, just standing there, staring at me. My stomach churned as I realized he wasn't going to come inside. He was waiting for me to leave. I stepped into the store, my hands shaking as I pretended to browse the shelves. I didn't need anything, but I grabbed a random pack of gum just to have an excuse to stay. The cashier gave me a curious look as I lingered near the counter, clearly not in a hurry to leave. I debated telling her what was going on, but didn't want to sound paranoid. After what felt like an eternity, I peeked outside. He was gone. I let out a shaky breath, hoping he had finally given up and wandered off. I paid for the gum and stepped outside, my eyes scanning the street nervously. It seemed clear. so I decided to head back to my apartment, taking a different route just to be safe. When I finally made it home, I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the couch, my heart still racing. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even though I knew I was alone. I double-checked all the locks and even put a chair under the doorknob, just in case. The next morning, I told a coworker about what had happened. She suggested I report it to the police, but I wasn't sure what I would even say. He hadn't done anything illegal, technically. He hadn't touched me or spoken to me or made any threats. Still, the memory of his eyes following me haunted me for days. I started taking a different train after that, leaving work earlier so I wouldn't have to ride home in the dark. I never saw the man again, but the experience left a mark on me. I used to feel safe in my routine, in the familiarity of my daily commute. Now I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if I'll ever run into someone like him again. It happened late one night when I was driving back from a weekend trip to visit my parents. The highway stretched out endlessly before me, and the only thing keeping me awake was the caffeine from the gas station coffee I'd grabbed a couple of hours earlier. I was about an hour away from home when my gas light came on. Reluctantly, I pulled off at the next exit and found a small, dimly lit gas station tucked away in a quiet corner of nowhere. The place had an eerie vibe. The neon sign flickered like something out of a horror movie, and there was only one other car in the lot, a beat-up sedan parked near the convenience store entrance. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild because I was tired. I pulled up to the pump closest to the road, figuring I'd be safer sticking to the more open area. As I got out of the car to start fueling, I noticed her. A woman in her late 40s, or maybe early 50s, stood leaning against the wall of the convenience store, smoking a cigarette. She was dressed in jeans and a flannel shirt, and her hair was pulled back into a messy ponytail. At first glance, she seemed ordinary enough, but something about the way she stared at me made my skin crawl. Her eyes were too intense, too focused, like she was sizing me up for something. I tried not to make eye contact, focusing on the gas pump instead, but I could feel her watching me, and it was impossible to ignore. When I glanced up, she gave me a tight smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. Then, without any hesitation, she started walking toward me. She stopped a few feet away, just outside of what most people would consider a comfortable distance. She said something about it being a quiet night, her voice low and raspy, probably from years of smoking. I nodded politely, not wanting to be rude, but I didn't say much. I figured if I kept the interaction short, she'd leave me alone. Instead, she asked where I was headed. That's when my alarm bell started ringing. I told her I was just passing through, hoping she'd lose interest, but she didn't. She kept asking questions where I'd come from, whether I was traveling alone, how far I had to go. Her tone was casual, almost friendly, but the questions felt invasive. I lied, saying I was meeting someone nearby, hoping it would discourage her from thinking I was an easy target. She didn't seem convinced. I could feel the tension building, the unease settling deeper into my gut. My hand tightened on the gas pump handle as I watched her out of the corner of my eye. She kept glancing back toward the convenience store, where the beat-up sedan. I started wondering if someone else was inside, waiting for her signal. My mind raced through worst-case scenarios, and I realized I needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. When the gas pump clicked, signaling that my tank was full, I wasted no time. I pulled the nozzle out, replaced it, and slid into my car, locking the doors behind me. The woman didn't move at first, just stood there watching me with that unsettling smile. As I started the engine, she leaned in closer, tapping on my window. She said something I couldn't hear, her voice muffled through the glass, but her expression didn't match her words. It was cold, almost predatory. I shook my head and mouthed something like, "I have to go." Then I pulled out of the lot, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. In my rearview mirror, I saw her standing there, watching me drive away. I thought that was the end of it, but I was wrong. As I emerged back onto the highway, headlights appeared in the distance behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was late, and there were bound to be other cars on the road. But as the minutes passed, I noticed that the headlights weren't fading. The car was staying behind me, matching my speed no matter how much I accelerated or slowed down. My chest tightened as I realized it was the same beat-up sedan from the gas station. Panic started to set in. I didn't know what she wanted or why she was following me, but I knew I had to lose her. I sped up, weaving in and out of lanes, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. For a moment, I thought it had worked. The headlights disappeared, and I let out a shaky breath, thinking I was in the clear. But then, a few miles later, there they were again. Closer this time. The car stayed right on my tail, its high beams glaring into my rearview mirror. My hands were shaking as I tried to think of what to do. Should I call the police? Should I pull over and hope she'd drive past? Neither option seemed safe. I spotted an exit up ahead and made a split-second decision to take it, veering off the highway without signaling. The car followed, and my heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. The exit led to a small town, its streets nearly deserted at this hour. I turned down one street, then another, trying to lose her in the maze of roads. At one point I thought I'd finally shaken her, but as I rounded a corner, the sedan appeared again, cutting me off. She pulled up alongside me, her window rolled down. I could see her face clearly now, and it was twisted into a look of pure rage. She shouted something I couldn't hear, pounding her fist on the steering wheel. I didn't wait to see what she would do next. I floored the gas pedal, swerving around her car and heading for the main road. Eventually, I spotted a police station up ahead, its lights a beacon of safety in the darkness. I pulled into the lot, shaking as I parked my car. The sedan didn't follow this time. I watched as it sped past, disappearing into the night. For a long time, I just sat there, trying to calm my breathing and process what had just happened. The next morning, I reported the incident to the local police, giving them a description of the woman in her car. They took my statement, but didn't seem particularly hopeful about catching her. They said it was likely someone with a history of harassing strangers at gas stations, a petty criminal looking for an easy target. That didn't make me feel any better. To this day, I can't stop thinking about what might have happened if I hadn't made it to that police station. The woman at the gas station seemed harmless at first glance, just another stranger passing through the night. But beneath that facade was something much darker, something I never want to encounter again. It started on a warm autumn afternoon when I decided to take a walk in the park near my apartment. The trees were shedding their leaves, and the air had that crisp, earthy smell that always feels nostalgic. I had been feeling stressed from work and thought some fresh air might help clear my head. The park was quiet, mostly empty except for a few joggers and a couple of dog walkers. I made my way toward the trail that looped around the small lake in the center. As I walked, I noticed an older man sitting on a bench near the trailhead. He looked ordinary enough: gray hair, glasses, a windbreaker that seemed a little too big for him. He had a notebook in his lap and was scribbling something down with a pen. At first glance, I thought he might be a bird watcher jotting down notes about what he'd seen. He didn't look up as I passed, and I barely gave him a second thought. About halfway through my walk, I stopped by the lake to sit on one of the benches and watch the ducks paddling around. It was peaceful, the kind of moment that makes you forget your worries, even if just for a little while. But then I saw him again, the man from the trailhead. He was standing on the opposite side of the lake watching me. His notebook was tucked under his arm now, and he seemed to be staring straight at me. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, that he was probably just enjoying the view like I was. Still, the way he stood there, unmoving, made me uncomfortable. I decided to get up and continue my walk, brushing off the unease. I told myself I was overreacting, letting my imagination run wild, but as I rounded the next bend in the trail, I glanced back and saw him again. This time he was a little closer, standing near a tree just off the path. He wasn't writing in his notebook anymore, just holding it by his side and watching me. I quickened my pace, suddenly feeling the need to get out of the park as quickly as possible. I thought about turning back toward the entrance, but decided against it, figuring it might be safer to stick to the open trail where other people could see me. The trail looped back to the parking lot eventually, so I kept walking, trying to act like I hadn't noticed him. The feeling of being watched didn't go away, though. Every few minutes I'd glance over my shoulder and catch a glimpse of him in the distance, always keeping the same pace as me. He never got too close, but he never disappeared either. It was like he wanted me to know he was there without actually approaching me. When I finally made it back to the parking lot, I was relieved to see a few more people around. There was a family loading their bikes into the back of an SUV, and a couple sitting on a picnic blanket near the entrance. I slowed down, trying to blend in and act natural. I didn't want to panic or draw attention to myself. I figured the man would back off now that there were witnesses around. But as I walked toward the park exit, I spotted him again. He was sitting on another bench near the lot, his notebook open in his lap. This time he wasn't writing, just staring at the pages like he was deep in thought. I couldn't tell if he had followed me the whole way, or if he had somehow taken a shortcut to get there before me. Either way, it felt calculated, like he was trying to unsettle me on purpose. I made it home without incident that day, but the experience stayed with me. I told myself it was probably nothing, that he was just a harmless old man who happened to be in the same park at the same time as me. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than that. The next day, I decided to go for another walk, hoping to prove to myself that the whole thing had been a fluke. I told myself that the park was public property and that I shouldn't let one strange encounter ruin it for me. But as soon as I stepped onto the trail, I felt that same unease creeping back in. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see him again, and then I did. He was sitting on the same bench as the day before, his notebook open in his lap. This time he was watching me openly, not even pretending to write. His eyes followed me as I walked past, and I couldn't help but notice the faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't a friendly smile, though. It was something else, something that sent a chill down my spine. I didn't make it far that day. I turned around and left the park, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself I wouldn't go back, that it wasn't worth the risk, but the problem didn't stop there. Over the next few days, I started seeing him in other places. Once I spotted him standing outside the coffee shop I visited every morning, his notebook in hand. Another time, he was sitting on a bench near my apartment building, staring up at the windows as if trying to figure out which one was mine. Each time he was alone, and each time he was watching me. I considered going to the police, but what could I tell them? That an old man with a notebook seemed to be following me? He hadn't done anything illegal, and I didn't even know his name. Without any evidence, I was sure they wouldn't take me seriously. Still, I started to feel like a prisoner in my own home, too afraid to go out in case he was there. One evening, I finally decided to confront him. I spotted him sitting on the bench outside my apartment again, just like before. Summoning all the courage I could muster, I walked up to him and asked what he wanted. His response was strange. He said he was documenting the world around him, that he was just an observer. He said I had nothing to worry about, that he wasn't dangerous, but the way he said it didn't make me feel any better. His tone was too calm, too detached, like he didn't see me as a person but as some kind of subject for his notes. I asked him to leave me alone, to stop following me, but he just smiled that same unsettling smile and said he couldn't do that. After that, I started changing my routines, taking different routes to work and avoiding the places I usually went. For a while it seemed to work. I stopped seeing him around, and I began to think that maybe he had finally gotten bored and moved on. But even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching from a distance, waiting for the right moment to reappear. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, and I don't think I ever will, but I've learned to trust my instincts. If something feels off, it probably is, and if you ever see someone with a notebook watching you a little too closely, my advice is to get away as fast as you can. You never know what they might be writing about or why. It happened during a long road trip I took last spring. I had always loved driving. There was something about the open road and the endless possibilities that made me feel free. This particular trip was supposed to be a relaxing getaway, just me and my car. I was heading to a small cabin I'd rented in the mountains, looking forward to a weekend of peace and solitude. The first few hours of the drive were uneventful. The highway stretched on for miles, cutting through fields and forests with little traffic to slow me down. I had my playlist going and the windows cracked just enough to let the cool breeze in. It was perfect, but things started to take a turn as the sun began to set. The highway became emptier, the stretches between rest stops longer. The sky shifted into deep hues of orange and pink before fading to black. I was still about 2 hours away from my destination when I noticed a car pulled over on the shoulder up ahead. At first, I didn't think much of it. Breakdowns happen all the time, especially on long stretches of road like this. As I got closer, I saw a woman standing next to the car, waving her arms. She looked distressed, pacing back and forth as if she wasn't sure what to do. I debated whether to stop. I'd always been the type to help when I could, but something about the situation gave me pause. Maybe it was the remote location or the way her car looked. It was old, with dents and scratches all over, like it had seen better days. Still, I figured she might genuinely need help, so I slowed down and pulled over a little ahead of her. I stepped out of my car and asked if everything was okay. She said her car had broken down and that her phone was dead. She asked if I could give her a ride to the next town, where she could call for help. Her voice was calm, but there was something about her demeanor that didn't sit right with me. She wasn't panicked the way you'd expect someone to be in that situation. Instead, she seemed calculated, like she was choosing her words carefully. I hesitated but didn't want to leave her stranded. I told her she could ride with me to the next town, which was about 20 minutes away. She smiled, thanked me, and grabbed a small bag from her car before getting into mine. As soon as she sat down, I noticed how tense she was, clutching her bag tightly and glancing around the car like she was sizing it up. We started driving, and the silence between us quickly became uncomfortable. I tried to make small talk, asking her where she was headed and what had happened to her car. Her answers were vague, almost rehearsed, like she was deflecting. She said she was visiting family but didn't mention where. When I asked about the car, she just shrugged and said it had been acting up for a while. The whole thing felt off, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. After about 10 minutes, I noticed something strange. She wasn't looking at the road or out the window. Instead, she was staring at me. Not in a curious or friendly way, but in a way that made my skin crawl. Her eyes were unblinking, her expression unreadable. I tried to focus on driving, but I could feel her gaze on me, heavy and unsettling. Then she asked a question that sent a chill down my spine. She wanted to know if I was traveling alone. I didn't know how to respond. I felt my grip tighten on the steering wheel as I quickly lied, telling her I was meeting friends at the cabin and that they were expecting me soon. She didn't say anything after that, just nodded and went back to clutching her bag. I started to regret picking her up. Every instinct in me was screaming that something wasn't right, but I didn't want to panic. I kept driving, hoping we'd reach the next town quickly so I could drop her off and be done with it. But then she did something that nearly made me pull over. She opened her bag and took out what looked like a large knife. She didn't say anything, didn't explain why she had it. She just held it in her lap, her fingers brushing the blade like it was the most normal thing in the world. My heart was racing, but I tried to stay calm. I asked her what the knife was for, and she said it was for protection. Her tone was casual, almost dismissive, like I shouldn't be concerned. I decided right then and there that I wasn't taking her to the next town. I needed to get her out of my car as soon as possible. I told her I needed to stop for gas, even though I still had half a tank. She didn't argue, just nodded and went back to staring out the window, the knife still in her lap. When we reached the next gas station, I pulled in and parked near the pumps. I told her I needed to use the restroom and that I'd be right back. As soon as I got inside the gas station, I went straight to the cashier and told him what was going on. He looked out at my car, saw her sitting there with the knife, and immediately called the police. I stayed inside the gas station, watching from the window as she started to get restless. She looked around, probably wondering what was taking me so long. Then, to my horror, she got out of the car and started walking toward the gas station. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. The police arrived just in time. 2 officers pulled up with their lights flashing, and she froze in her tracks. They approached her cautiously, asking her to put down the knife. She tried to argue, saying it was all a misunderstanding, but they weren't buying it. They took her into custody, and one of the officers came inside to talk to me. I explained everything that had happened, from picking her up on the highway to her pulling out the knife. The officer told me I'd made the right call by stopping at the gas station and getting help. He said they'd run her information and see if there were any warrants out for her arrest. I never found out who she was or what her intentions were, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly avoided something terrible. The rest of the drive to the cabin was a blur, and I spent the entire weekend trying to process what had happened. To this day, I think about that encounter every time I see someone stranded on the side of the road. I want to help, but I can't ignore the voice in my head telling me to keep driving. You never really know who you're letting into your life or your car.